The wire cutter bit into rusted barbed fence, each snip echoing across the frostbitten pasture. Elias worked the way he breathed now, steady, solitary, keeping his eyes on the broken posts rather than the empty saddle hanging in the barn doorway. He didn't look up when the porch steps groaned, just kept twisting the wire, listening to the scrape of worn leather boots on wood, the hesitant shuffle of someone who hadn't slept in a day or two. When he finally turned, she was standing by his woodpile, a canvas satchel slipping from her shoulder, cheeks flushed raw from the November wind. She didn't ask for water, didn't offer apologies for trespassing, just met his guarded stare with a quiet steadiness that felt entirely out of place on his land. He wiped his gloves on his coat. "I don't do second chances," the rancher said. She shifted her weight, exhaling a plume of frost. "Good, I only need one night." The wind carried the words away, but the weight of them settled heavy in his chest. Before we go further, subscribe if you haven't. Drop a like if you're already in. Now back to the ranch. The wire cutter bit into rusted barbed fence, each snip echoing across the frostbitten pasture. Elias worked the way he breathed now, steady, solitary, keeping his eyes on the broken posts rather than the empty saddle hanging in the barn doorway. He spoke only to the draft horses and kept the cabin orderly but cold, treating every sunrise as a task to endure. 3 winters had passed since the river took his wife, and grief had settled into his bones like November damp. Neighbors in the valley had long stopped dropping by, reading his quiet as a polite refusal to be drawn back into the world. He moved with mechanical precision, his clean-shaven face and broad frame bearing the weight of years that had narrowed to survival. The timberline broke open with the sound of stumbling boots. Clara Lindley emerged from the pines, a canvas satchel slipping from her shoulder, her wool hem torn and dark with mud. Her hired wagon had shattered its axle on the ridge miles back, leaving her to walk the last stretch through the biting wind. She didn't ask for water or offer apologies for trespassing. She just stood by his woodpile, cheeks flushed raw, and met his guarded stare with a quiet steadiness that felt entirely out of place on his land. "Morning stage runs at 8, she said, voice rough but even. "I only need a dry floor until then." Her hands trembled against her coat, but her posture held the quiet dignity of a woman refusing to become a burden. Elias watched the frost gather on her lashes, recognizing the exhaustion beneath her resolve. He wiped his gloves on his coat. "I don't do second chances," the rancher said. She shifted her weight, exhaling a plume of white. "Good. I only need one night." The sky answered before he could. A sudden squall rolled over the ridge, dropping snow thick enough to swallow the trail markers. Clara stepped back from the wind, her boot catching a buried root. A sharp twist, a choked breath, and she pressed her palm to the frozen earth. Elias was at her side before the second flake settled. Basic decency overrode the walls he'd spent years reinforcing. He carried her to the porch, the quiet weight of her presence cutting through his solitude. Inside, he cleared the spare cot in the parlor, brushing away years of undisturbed dust with stiff, efficient movements. "You stay off that foot," he said, laying out a wool blanket and a tin basin of warm water. "Rules are simple. Morning light, you're on the road. I don't run a boarding house." He kept his gaze fixed on the floorboards as he set the basin down. Clara accepted the terms with a quiet nod, her eyes tracing the room. The books were stacked by height, the hearth tools aligned by length, and the single photograph on the mantel sat face down. She understood then that the careful order wasn't about neatness. It was a quiet architecture of grief, built to keep the past contained so it wouldn't bleed into the present. The dawn did not arrive so much as it seeped into the valley, a pale, reluctant gray that clung to the frost-heavy grass and pooled in the hollows between the pines. Inside the cabin, the silence had a weight to it, a familiar pressure that Elias had long stopped trying to push away. He rose before the light fully claimed the horizon, moving through the rooms with the practiced economy of a man who treated warmth as a commodity rather than a comfort. The stove in the kitchen remained cold until he struck a match, coaxing flame into the iron belly with careful breaths and dry kindling. He measured his coffee, poured the water, and set the tin pot on the grate, the routine a metronome that kept his thoughts from wandering into territory he no longer visited. 3 winters had passed, yet the house still held the shape of absence. Books sat precisely aligned on the shelf. Coats hung at equal intervals on the pegs. Even the dust seemed to settle in obedient lines. It was order, but it was the kind of order that only exists when something vital has been removed. The sound of shifting blankets came from the parlor. Clara was awake. He did not turn toward the sound. Instead, he focused on the stubborn latch of the cabinet door, working the rusted hinge with a drop of oil and a firm twist. When footsteps finally appeared on the floorboards, they were hesitant, then steadier. She entered the kitchen wrapped in a wool shawl that had seen better years, her hair pinned loosely at the nape of her neck, her cheeks still carrying the faint pink of sleep and lingering chill. She offered a quiet nod. He returned it with a brief dip of his chin. Neither reached for conversation. She moved to the stove, peering into the iron grate as if trying to decipher its temperament. "It needs air from below," she said, voice still rough from the night's rest. "And less wood on top. You're choking it." Elias set his cup down. "It draws fine. Only when it wants to." She knelt, ignoring the draft that slipped through the warped floorboards, and adjusted the damper with careful fingers. The fire caught, flaring slightly before settling into a steady blue and gold burn. She sat back on her heels, wiping soot from her knuckles with the edge of her sleeve. "There, it'll behave now." He watched her for a second too long before turning away. "Help yourself to flour if you're making breakfast." What followed was a quiet collision of habits. Clara believed in working dough until it yielded. Elias believed in measuring exactly and trusting the recipe. She rolled out biscuits with a rolling pin that had seen decades of use, her wrists moving with a rhythm that spoke of practice rather than precision. He stood by the counter, watching flour dust the air like early snow, his jaw tight as she reached for the butter crock without asking where it was kept. The kitchen, once a space of solitary utility, suddenly felt occupied in a way that made his shoulders tense. When a pan slipped from her grip and clattered against the iron hearth, he closed his eyes briefly. When she murmured an apology that carried more exhaustion than embarrassment, he opened them again. "It's fine," he said. "It's cast iron. It's survived worse." She managed a faint smile. "I hope the stove forgives me. It's been a long road." He poured a second cup of coffee and set it on the edge of the table. Not an invitation, just an acknowledgement. She took it without comment, her fingers wrapping around the ceramic as if drawing heat from it. The silence that followed was not the heavy quiet of before. It was different, thinner, more breathable. By mid-morning, the cabin had begun to rearrange itself in small, almost invisible ways. Elias returned from the yard to find his heavy work boots no longer scattered haphazardly by the door, but aligned neatly against the wall, mud scraped clean from the soles. His coat, usually draped over a chair with careless fatigue, hung on a peg, the collar straightened. A stack of firewood sat higher near the hearth than he had left it, the logs split evenly and stacked with a care that suggested time had been spent rather than wasted. He stood in the entryway, his gloves still damp from the cold, and felt a strange, unfamiliar tightness in his chest. It wasn't irritation. It was something closer to recognition. He found her in the parlor, seated on the spare cot with a ledger open across her knees. The pages were filled with his own cramped, hurried handwriting, a record of feed purchases, fence repairs, and seasonal cattle counts that had long since lost any sense of order. She was not reading it passively. She was copying it into a fresh notebook, her pen moving with steady, deliberate strokes. Columns aligned, dates corrected, totals checked twice. "You didn't have to do that," he said from the doorway. She looked up, her expression calm but alert. The numbers were fighting each other. "I thought I'd introduce them to peace." A beat of silence passed. Then, unexpectedly, the corner of his mouth twitched. It wasn't a smile, not quite, but it was close enough to startle him. He looked away, adjusting his cuffs as if the gesture might erase the reaction. "Keep it simple. I only need to know what's spent and what's owed." "I'll keep it simple," she agreed, returning to the page. "But I'll keep it accurate, too." He left the room before she could notice the way his shoulders had dropped, just slightly, from their usual defensive line. Outside, the wind carried the scent of pine and distant snow. He walked toward the barn, but his steps felt lighter than they had in years. The house behind him no longer felt like a vault. It felt like a place where someone was awake. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that neither of them had planned but both began to rely on. Clara's presence did not announce itself with grand gestures or sweeping declarations. It arrived in quiet increments, like the slow return of spring water to a dry creek bed. She mended a torn saddlebag with precise, even stitches, her fingers working the thick leather with a patience that matched his own. She sorted through a drawer of scattered nails, screws, and broken harness buckles, organizing them into labeled tins with a practical efficiency that left no room for argument. When the stubborn bay mule refused to step over a newly laid gate threshold, she did not raise her voice or pull the reins harder. She simply stood beside him, speaking in a low, steady tone, rubbing his muzzle until the tension left the animal's jaw, and he stepped forward with a soft exhale. Elias watched these moments from a distance at first, then closer, then without meaning to at all. He began leaving extra firewood stacked by the parlor chair before the evening chill set in. He noticed the chipped teacup she favored most, the one with the faded blue rim, and replaced it with a sturdy porcelain mug from the supply crate, setting it quietly on the drying rack without mentioning it. She found it that afternoon. She did not thank him with words. She simply filled it with tea, carried it to the table, and set it beside his own. The gesture required no translation. Their conversations, once limited to weather reports and supply lists, began to stretch into quieter territories. They spoke of the land as if it were a living thing rather than a resource. She noted how the frost clung longer to the eastern ridge, how the pines sounded different when the wind came from the north. He told her about the old trail markers his grandfather had carved, the ones that still stood beneath layers of moss and time. They did not share stories of loss. They did not need to. The space between them had become wide enough to hold unspoken things without collapsing. One evening, as the fire burned low and the cabin filled with the amber glow of settling embers, Clara sat at the table with a stack of invoices, her pen pausing mid-stroke. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked, not looking up. "The noise, I mean, before it was just you." Elias stood by the hearth, feeding a split log into the grate. The flames caught, casting long shadows across the walls. "Noise doesn't fix broken things," he said quietly. "It just covers them up." She closed the ledger gently. "Maybe. But sometimes noise means people are still here, still trying." He turned to look at her. The firelight caught the line of her jaw, the quiet determination in her eyes, the way her hands rested on the table not as if claiming space, but as if offering it. He did not answer. He didn't need to. The silence that followed was no longer empty. It was full of something he had forgotten how to name. By the end of the second week, Clara was no longer moving through the property as a guest waiting for the road to clear. She was moving through it as someone who belonged to the work. She began taking her daily walks along the property perimeter, leaning on a carved walking stick she'd whittled from a fallen birch branch. her steps measured but confident despite the lingering stiffness in her ankle. She memorized the fence lines, noted where the posts leaned too far into the wind, where the soil had washed away from the roots, where the cattle grazed closest to the timber line. She carried a small notebook with her, not for ledgers but for observations. The land was speaking, and she had learned how to listen. Word of her presence traveled faster than the stagecoach route. When she passed the Miller homestead on the eastern ridge, she found two of the rancher's youngest children sitting on a stump, struggling with slate tablets and chalk. She did not offer charity. She offered trade. "I'll teach you figures that add up," she said, "if you bring me a dozen eggs and a sack of winter onions next week." The children's mother, a weary but sharp-eyed woman named Maeve, appeared in the doorway with a blanket over her shoulders. She watched Clara for a long moment, then nodded. "You're welcome here, long as you don't break their spirits with multiplication." "I only plan to break their bad habits," Clara replied. "Numbers don't care about pride." She returned to the cabin that afternoon with a small cloth sack of supplies, her cheeks flushed from the cold, her eyes bright with a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with obligation. Elias was mending a harness strap at the workbench, his hands moving with practiced ease. He did not look up immediately. He let the silence stretch just long enough to acknowledge the shift in the room. "You're teaching children," he said finally. "Arithmetic," she corrected, setting the sack on the counter. "It's harder than it looks. They want to know why they need it." "And what did you tell them?" "That numbers don't lie, and they don't leave." He set down the awl. The words settled over him like a heavy coat, familiar but newly weighted. He had spent years building walls to keep the past from leaking into the present, yet here she was, turning simple lessons into something that felt like anchor lines. He did not say thank you. He simply pushed a tin of dried apples toward her. "You'll need strength for tomorrow, winds shifting." She smiled, a real one this time, small but unguarded. "Noted." The next day brought the freight driver, a grizzled man named Harlan who ran a twice-monthly supply route between the valley and the territorial depot. He pulled up to the gate in a wagon drawn by two weary horses, his beard frosted with ice, his coat patched at the elbows. Clara met him at the fence line before Elias could even step off the porch. She did not ask for favors. She proposed terms. Coffee, flour, thread, and winter wool in exchange for a portion of the ranch's surplus feed and a written guarantee of future trade. She spoke clearly, backed her numbers with the ledgers she'd organized, and when Harlan hesitated, she offered a firm handshake rather than a plea. He agreed, not out of pity, out of respect. Elias watched from the steps, his hands buried in his coat pockets, his breath pluming in the cold air. He had spent years believing that independence meant carrying every burden alone, that asking for anything was a sign of fracture. Clara was proving otherwise. She was not leaning on him. She was standing beside him, building something that did not require his permission to exist. When she turned back toward the house, her eyes met his across the yard. There was no triumph in her gaze. Only quiet certainty. He nodded once. She nodded back. The distance between them felt shorter not because either had moved but because the ground beneath them had finally stopped shifting. That evening the cabin felt different, not in structure but in atmosphere. The fire burned brighter. The floorboards creaked with familiar footsteps rather than empty echoes. Clara sat at the table, sorting through the newly arrived thread spools, her movements unhurried, her shoulders relaxed in a way he had not seen before. He stood by the window, watching the snow begin to fall again, light and steady, covering the yard in a fresh blanket that erased the marks of yesterday. He should have been thinking about the morning's chores, the fence line that needed reinforcing, the mule that still favored his left hoof. Instead, he was listening. He caught himself waiting for the sound of her footsteps on the porch before he started his evening routine, not because he needed her to do anything, because the house had begun to breathe with her in it. He found himself polishing his good shirt without thinking, running a damp cloth over the cotton collar, smoothing the fabric until it lay flat against the line. He caught his reflection in the dark glass of the window, a man with a clean-shaven face, broad shoulders, and eyes that no longer looked like they were bracing for impact. The tightness in his chest, the one that had lived there for 3 years like a second rib, had begun to ease, not vanish, just loosen. He turned back to the room. Clara had set the thread aside and was stirring a pot of stew, the wooden spoon moving in slow, even circles. She hummed a tune under her breath, something old and nameless, the kind of melody that lingers in kitchens and porches and quiet afternoons. He did not recognize it. He did not need to. He simply stood there, letting the sound fill the space between them. "You're making too much," he said finally, breaking the quiet. She glanced over her shoulder, a faint smile touching her lips. "It's winter. Appetites grow when the cold does." "I don't have a large appetite." "You will," she said, turning back to the pot. "If you keep standing by the window like a sentry, you'll work yourself thin." He almost argued, almost reminded her that he had survived just fine on silence and routine for years. But the words caught in his throat, replaced by something quieter, heavier, truer. He walked to the table, pulled out a chair, and sat down. He did not speak. He simply watched the steam rise from the pot, listened to the soft scrape of wood against iron, felt the unfamiliar weight of anticipation settle over him. It was not fear. It was not hope. It was something in between. A recognition that the rigid architecture of survival was slowly giving way to something else. Something that moved at a different pace. Something that required patience instead of defense. When she finally ladled the stew into 2 bowls and set one before him, she did not sit across from him. She sat beside him, close enough that their sleeves nearly touched, far enough that the space between them still felt respectful. He picked up his spoon. She did the same. The first bite was warm, rich, familiar in a way that had nothing to do with taste and everything to do with presence. He ate in silence. She did the same. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and steady, covering the land in quiet renewal. Inside, the house no longer felt like a place where time had stopped. It felt like a place where it had finally begun again. He did not know what to call it yet. He did not need to. The feeling was enough. For the first time in 3 years, he was not waiting for the next loss. He was waiting for tomorrow. And that, in itself, was a kind of surrender. He's finally stopped waiting for the next loss. But the house is still quiet, and that quiet is about to break. If this quiet surrender has you locked in, hit that like button now and subscribe if you haven't. Because what happens when their hands finally touch is coming in the next few minutes, and you won't see how it changes everything. Stay with me. The morning brought a cold so sharp it seemed to crystallize the very air, turning breath into visible plumes that hung heavy before the wind snatched them away. Elias had already been in the yard for an hour, his boots crunching through a thin crust of frost that covered the packed earth like shattered glass. The task was simple, routine, the kind of labor he used to measure out his days, hauling a 50-gallon water barrel from the well to the trough beside the main corral. He gripped the wooden handles, feeling the familiar burn in his shoulders, the steady rhythm of his boots against the frozen ground. He preferred work that required only strength and repetition. It left no room for thought, and thought was a door he kept firmly bolted. Clara was on the porch, sorting through a basket of mended linens. She wore a heavy wool coat over her dress, her breath puffing in quiet sync with the morning's chill. She didn't speak. She simply watched him work, her presence a quiet counterpoint to the harsh geometry of his routine. He didn't look at her. He focused on the barrel, the weight, the path ahead. Then the ice shifted. It happened without warning. A hidden patch of black ice concealed beneath a dusting of snow near the woodshed steps. His boot found it, traction vanished, and his body pitched forward. The heavy barrel swung violently, threatening to drag him down into the hard-packed earth. Instinct took over before pride could intervene. Clara dropped the linens and moved, crossing the porch steps in 3 quick strides. Her hand shot out, catching his forearm just below the rolled cuff of his flannel shirt. Her grip was surprisingly firm, her fingers pressing into the tense muscle as she braced her weight against his sudden fall. They held the balance together, a fragile equilibrium of shifting weight and arrested momentum. For a breath that stretched far too long, the world narrowed to the space between them. Her hands were warm despite the cold, her touch a stark contrast to the biting air. He could feel the rapid pulse in her wrist, the steady pressure of her palms against his skin. She looked up, her eyes wide, her chest rising and falling with exertion. He looked down. The careful distance they had maintained for weeks collapsed in an instant. The scent of wood smoke and dried pine clung to her coat. The faint flush on her cheeks wasn't from the wind alone. Something quiet and undeniable passed between them, a current of awareness that had been building beneath layers of routine and restraint. Elias felt it immediately. A dangerous warmth bloomed low in his chest, unwelcome and terrifying. It wasn't desire in the way he understood it. It was recognition. It was the sudden, jarring realization that he was no longer numb. That her presence had carved a hollow in his isolation and filled it with something he had no name for. Panic, cold and sharp, followed instantly. He straightened, gently but firmly extricating his arm from her grasp. The space between them rushed back in, heavy and sudden. He cleared his throat, the sound rough in the quiet yard. "I've got it," he said, his voice tighter than he intended. He righted the barrel, his hands moving with forced steadiness, avoiding her eyes. She didn't apologize. She simply stepped back, gathering the fallen linens with quiet dignity, but her hands trembled slightly as she folded them. He turned and walked toward the barn without another word. His boots felt heavier with each step. By the time he reached the stable doors, his chest was tight, his breath shallow. He leaned against the rough-hewn timber, closing his eyes as the memory of her touch lingered on his skin like a brand. It should have meant nothing. It was a practical catch, a momentary accident, but the warmth wouldn't leave him. It sat beneath his ribs, quiet and insistent, unraveling the careful order he had spent years constructing. He opened his eyes, stared out at the frostbitten pasture, and felt the first true crack in his armor. He retreated into the dim quiet of the barn, suddenly acutely aware that the house behind him no longer felt like a refuge. It felt like a place he was no longer willing to face alone. The memory arrived not as a thought, but as a physical weight. It came with the smell of wet wool, the sound of rushing water, the image of a pale hand slipping from his grasp. The freezing river. 3 winters passed. The ice had been thin that day, deceptively smooth under a layer of fresh snow. His wife had stepped too close to the bank, chasing a stray dog that had bolted into the reeds. The crack had been loud, almost cheerful in its finality. She had looked back at him, eyes wide, not with fear, but with a quiet acceptance that still haunted his dreams. He had reached for her. He had missed. The current had taken her before he could draw his next breath. He had spent the years since convincing himself that survival required emotional surrender to the past, that any new attachment was both a betrayal of her memory and a prelude to ruin. Love, in his mind, was a ledger that always ended in debt. Clara's presence had already begun to shift that ledger, and now the memory of the river roared back with violent clarity, drowning out the quiet progress they had made. He felt it in the way he avoided her gaze the next morning, in the way his replies grew clipped, in the way he took his meals in the barn instead of at the kitchen table. He told himself it was discipline. He told himself it was honor. He told himself that distance was the only way to keep the past from bleeding into the present. It was Silas who broke through the silence 2 days later. An old trail partner from his early ranching years, Silas rode in on a dappled roan, his coat patched at the elbows, his face lined by decades of sun and wind. He didn't announce his visit. He simply tied his horse to the fence post, walked up the steps, and found Elias splitting firewood with a rhythm that bordered on violent. Silas leaned against the porch rail, watching for a long moment before speaking. "You're chopping wood like it owes you money, Elias." Elias didn't stop swinging. "It's cold." "It's always cold in February." Silas pushed off the rail, stepping onto the porch. He didn't look at the house. He looked at his old friend. "You've got a woman staying in your parlor, a good one by the look of things. She's got your ledgers sorted, your mule walking straight, and the neighbors talking about how your place finally smells like bread again. And you're out here trying to split the past in two." Elias finally lowered the maul, his breath pluming in the chill. "She's leaving when the road's clear." "Is she?" Silas's voice was quiet, devoid of accusation, heavy with the kind of truth only an old friend could voice. "Or are you trying to make her leave before you have to admit you don't want her to?" The words landed like stones in still water. Elias gripped the maul handle, his knuckles whitening. "I don't owe anyone my future, Silas. I lost someone, I carry it. That's the cost." "Carrying it isn't the same as living in it," Silas replied gently. "Walls keep the wind out, sure, but they keep the sun out too. And they don't keep the past from echoing forward. They just make the echo louder in an empty room." Elias turned away, picking up another log. He didn't answer. He couldn't. The truth in Silas's words was a mirror he refused to look into. He doubled down on his work that afternoon, hauling feed, checking fence posts, mending harness straps with meticulous, almost punishing focus. He avoided the house. He avoided Clara's quiet footsteps on the floorboards. He convinced himself again and again that distance was the only honorable path. That stepping forward meant forgetting. That staying frozen meant loyalty. He told himself it was strength. But as the sun dipped below the ridge, painting the snow in shades of bruised purple and cold gold, he knew it was fear. And fear, he was beginning to understand, was a terrible foundation for a life. The southern fence line had been troubling him for weeks. A washout near the creek bend had weakened 3 posts, and the cattle had taken to drifting too close to the timberline. Clara noticed his concern during their brief morning exchanges, the way his eyes kept drifting toward the distant tree line, the way his jaw tightened when he spoke of the coming snow. She didn't ask permission. She simply packed a thermos of broth, wrapped herself in her thickest coat, and took her carved walking stick out into the late afternoon light. She meant to check the posts, mark the damage, and return before dusk. She meant to be useful without becoming a burden. She miscalculated the wind. It picked up without warning, howling down from the northern ridge, carrying with it a biting chill that slipped through wool and leather alike. She worked carefully, marking the leaning posts, noting where the wire had snapped. But the cold seeped into her joints, slowing her movements, draining her strength. By the time she turned back toward the house, the trail was a white blur, the temperature had plummeted, and her body was shivering so violently she could barely keep her footing. She made it to the porch, collapsed onto the bottom step, and dropped her walking stick before the darkness pulled her under. Elias found her when he returned from the corral. One moment he was leading a horse, the next he was kneeling in the snow, his hands on her shoulders, his voice calling her name. Her skin was ice. Her breath came in shallow, rapid pulls. He didn't hesitate. He carried her inside, kicked the door shut, and built the fire until the hearth roared. He stripped off her wet boots, wrapped her in every dry blanket he owned, and pressed a basin of cool water to her fevered brow. He worked through the night in a state of quiet panic, the careful stoicism he had worn like armor finally cracking under the weight of helpless dread. Hours passed. The wind howled outside. Inside, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the soft scrape of cloth against wood, and his own ragged breathing. He changed the cloths. He coaxed broth past her lips. He watched the rise and fall of her chest, praying to a god he hadn't spoken to in years. Near midnight she stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, glassy with fever, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have. I don't want to be a burden." The words shattered what was left of his restraint. He sat heavily on the edge of the cot, his hands trembling as he brushed a damp strand of hair from her forehead. His voice, when it finally came, was rough, fractured, stripped bare. "You're not a burden," he said, the words tearing out of him like they'd been trapped behind glass for years. "You're the only thing that's made this place feel alive. I've been so afraid, so paralyzed by the thought of losing someone again that I forgot how to keep someone. I thought if I didn't care, I wouldn't break. But I'm already broken, Clara. I'm just tired of pretending I'm whole." He didn't wipe his eyes. He let the tears fall, hot and unashamed, onto the back of his hands. He stayed there as the night stretched into dawn, watching her breathe, feeling the weight of his own confession settle into the room like a long-awaited storm. The dam had finally broken, and beneath the ruin there was only truth. He stayed by her bedside until the first gray light of morning touched the window, no longer a man running from his past, but a man finally willing to face his present. Recovery came slowly, measured in quiet days and careful steps. Clara's strength returned in increments, her color gradually returning to her cheeks, her movements regaining their steady grace. But the atmosphere between them had shifted. The easy rhythm of shared meals and quiet conversations had been replaced by a fragile, aching tension. It wasn't hostility. It was the space left by raw honesty, the heavy quiet that follows a door being opened too wide too fast. Elias didn't know how to step forward. He had spent a lifetime building walls, and tearing them down left him exposed, uncertain, terrified of misplacing a single word, and sending them both retreating into old habits. So he spoke in gestures instead. It began with small things, deliberate and quiet, placed on the kitchen table where she would find them before morning tea. A bundle of dried pine needles, carefully tied with twine, chosen for the clean scent it would lend to her kettle. A neatly bound ledger, its pages filled with his own handwriting but corrected, aligned and cross-referenced with hers, a silent acknowledgement that he valued her order. A carefully carved wooden spoon, its handle smooth from hours of patient whittling, placed beside the flour crock without explanation. He didn't attach notes. He didn't demand acknowledgement. He simply left them, hoping she would understand the language he had spent years forgetting how to speak. Clara noticed. She always did. She picked up the pine bundle, pressed it to her nose, and smiled softly. She opened the ledger, traced the columns with her fingertips, and felt the quiet weight of his trust. She tested the wooden spoon, feeling the balance in her hand, the time and care carved into every curve. She didn't push. She didn't ask for more. She simply waited, reading his silence as a conversation of its own. She returned the care in kind, leaving a freshly folded blanket on his chair, aligning his tools just so, making sure the fire was banked before she retired for the night. Their days became a quiet dance of anticipation, a slow building of bridges across the space his fear had carved. She began sitting by the window in the late afternoons, watching him work in the yard, her presence a steady anchor. He would catch himself glancing toward the house, searching for the shadow of her shape against the glass, feeling a strange, unfamiliar peace settle over his chest when he found it. The tension wasn't gone. It had simply changed shape. It was no longer about distance. It was about timing. It was about the quiet understanding that some things couldn't be rushed, that healing required patience, That love wasn't a declaration but a choice made again and again in the space between words. One evening, as the fire burned low and the cabin filled with the amber glow of settling embers, Clara set a second cup of tea on the table beside his usual place. She didn't sit. She simply stood by the hearth, her hands folded loosely in front of her, her eyes meeting his across the quiet room. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The space between them was no longer a chasm. It was a threshold. And for the first time in a long time, Elias felt ready to cross it. The path to the creek was narrow, worn into the snow by years of solitary footsteps that had long since stopped expecting company. Elias walked it without looking back, his boots crunching through the packed powder, his breath pluming in the pale late afternoon light. The air was still, heavy with the kind of quiet that only settles over a valley when the wind finally exhausts itself. He didn't know exactly why he had come here. Perhaps because the cabin had grown too full of things left unsaid. Perhaps because he needed to stand somewhere the walls couldn't echo back his own hesitation. The creek lay frozen beneath a sheet of pale, uneven ice, the water still moving underneath in a slow, hidden current. Snow dusted the banks, clinging to the exposed roots and the skeletal branches of cottonwoods that leaned over the water like tired watchers. He stopped at the edge, his hands buried deep in his coat pockets, and stared down at the glassy surface. It was the same stretch of water that had taken so much from him 3 winters ago, but today it looked different. The ice wasn't a trap. It was just a season. Water waited beneath it. Life waited beneath it. He had spent years believing the cold was permanent. He heard her footsteps before he saw her. Not rushed, not hesitant, just steady, deliberate steps that stopped a few yards behind him. He didn't turn. He knew if he did, the carefully constructed words he had carried in his chest all afternoon would scatter into the wind. "You don't have to follow me out here," he said, his voice rough, carried away slightly by the chill. "I know," Clara replied. She didn't move closer. She simply stood there, letting the silence stretch between them until it felt less like a barrier and more like a shared space. "But I wanted to." Elias closed his eyes. The weight of everything he had carried for years pressed against his ribs, heavy and suffocating. But for the first time, it didn't feel like an anchor dragging him under. It felt like a ledger finally balancing. He had spent so long believing that grief was a debt he had to pay with solitude, that if he let the ache soften, he would be dishonoring the woman he had lost. That love was a ledger that always ended in ruin. But Clara had been in his life for weeks now, moving through his spaces with quiet grace, and the ache hadn't vanished. It had simply made room for something else. It had learned to share the hearth. "I didn't come out here to run," he said finally, the words slow, careful, as if testing the ice beneath them. "I came out here to stop pretending I'm fine with how things are." He turned his head slightly, just enough to see her in his periphery. She was wrapped in a heavy wool coat, her cheeks pink from the cold, her hands tucked into her sleeves. She didn't speak. She just waited, giving him the one thing he had never received from himself: patience. "You haven't erased her," he continued, his voice dropping lower, trembling at the edges. "You couldn't, and you shouldn't have to. She's part of why I am the way I am, part of why I keep my distance, part of why I spent years convincing myself that love was just a slower way to break." He swallowed hard, the cold air burning his throat. "But you walked into a house that had been frozen for years, and you didn't try to melt it all at once. You just lived in it. You made tea when the stove fought you. You sorted my scattered ledgers until the numbers stopped lying to me. You left extra firewood by the chair when you thought I wouldn't notice. You hummed while you stirred the pot. You made the quiet feel less like a punishment and more like company." His breath hitched. He forced himself to keep going, each word pulling weight from the stone he'd carried in his chest. "I've been so terrified of failing you, of opening my hands and watching something precious slip through them again. I tell myself I'm honoring the past by keeping my heart locked tight. But the truth is, I'm just hiding. I don't want to just survive the days anymore, Clara. I want to wake up and know why I'm getting out of bed. I want to build something that lasts, even if it scares me, even if I don't know how to do it right. He finally turned to face her fully. His hands came out of his pockets, hanging at his sides, open in a way he hadn't allowed in years. His chest rose and fell with the effort of speaking words that felt like stepping off a cliff into unknown air. I don't know how to promise I won't break. I only know I'm tired of being broken alone, and I'm terrified of losing you. But I'm more terrified of letting you walk away because I was too proud to stay. Clara didn't move right away. She let his words settle into the cold air, let them rest between them without rushing to fill the space. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and distant snow, but she didn't flinch. Then slowly she stepped forward. The snow crunched softly beneath her boots. She closed the distance until she was standing just inside his space, close enough that he could feel the quiet warmth radiating from her coat, close enough to see the steady certainty in her eyes. She didn't say anything at first. She simply reached out and placed her hand over his. Her fingers were warm, steady, grounding against his calloused, weathered skin. The contact was simple, but it carried the weight of everything he had just confessed. It anchored him. It told him he wasn't falling. He was finally being held. The quiet between them stretched, thick with unspoken understanding. He could feel the pulse in her wrist, steady and unhurried, a quiet rhythm that matched the slow, deliberate beat of his own heart. He had spent so long believing that vulnerability was a weakness, that admitting he needed someone meant he had failed to stand on his own. But standing there with her hand resting lightly over his, he realized how deeply wrong he had been. Strength wasn't about carrying everything alone. It was about knowing when to let someone share the weight. The ice beneath his boots felt solid. The air felt clearer. The past was still there, woven into the fabric of who he was, but it no longer dictated where he was going. For the first time in 3 years, he wasn't looking backward. He was finally ready to look forward. Clara's hand remained over his, the warmth of her skin a quiet counterpoint to the biting air. She didn't pull away. She didn't offer empty reassurances or rush to smooth over the raw edges of his confession. She simply let him feel the reality of her presence, steady and unyielding, like the deep roots of an old pine that had weathered every storm the valley could throw at it. "You keep talking like love is a ledger you have to balance," she said finally, her voice soft but clear, carrying easily over the stillness of the creek. "Like it's a debt that's going to come due the moment you let yourself feel it again." She shifted her weight slightly, her fingers gently curling around his knuckles. "But it isn't Elias. Love isn't a replacement, it's an expansion. It doesn't ask you to forget what you've lost. It just asks you to make room for what's still here." He looked down at their joined hands, the contrast between her smooth, capable fingers and his weathered, calloused palm striking him with sudden, quiet clarity. He had spent years believing that opening his heart meant erasing the past, as if joy and grief couldn't occupy the same space. But standing there in the cold, with her hand anchored over his, he realized how wrong he had been. Grief was a shape. Love was the light that learned to fit around it. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've forgotten how to be someone's first thought. I've forgotten how to hope without bracing for the fall." Clara's gaze didn't waver. "You don't have to hope perfectly, you just have to stay. That's all I've ever wanted. Not a man who's never known loss. Just a man who's willing to face tomorrow anyway." She stepped a fraction closer, the space between them shrinking until he could see the faint flecks of gold in her eyes, the quiet strength that had carried her through her own storms and still left her willing to stand in his. "Your careful, steady heart. It's exactly what I've been searching for. Not because it's flawless, but because it's real, because you show up, because you leave firewood, because you listen, Because you're still here." The words settled over him like a heavy, warm blanket, stripping away the last of his defenses. The fear that had gripped him for years didn't vanish entirely, but it lost its teeth. It became something manageable, something human. He realized then that she wasn't asking him to be someone else. She was asking him to be exactly who he had become and to let her walk beside him anyway. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply turned his hand beneath hers, lacing his fingers through hers in a slow, deliberate motion that felt like a promise. Then he closed the distance. The first touch of his lips to hers was hesitant, almost reverent. It was a question, not a demand. A careful testing of the ice, seeking the solid ground beneath. She didn't pull back. She met him with the same quiet certainty, her free hand rising to rest lightly against his coat, grounding him in the moment. The cold air faded. The sound of the hidden current beneath the ice blurred into the background. There was only the warmth of her breath, the steady rhythm of her pulse, the quiet surrender of two people who had finally stopped running from the same truth. The hesitation melted slowly, replaced by a deep, certain certainty. His arm came around her, drawing her closer, not with urgency but with the quiet confidence of a man who had finally found his footing. The kiss deepened, carrying the weight of years of held breath, unshed tears, and careful distance finally bridged. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't rushed. It was earned. It was the quiet, mutual choosing of two people who had learned that healing doesn't erase the past. It simply builds a future alongside it. When they finally parted, it was only by a fraction. Their foreheads rested together, their breath mingling in the cold air, their hands still tightly laced. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was full. It held the quiet hum of a life finally beginning to breathe. "I'm not going anywhere," he murmured, the words rough but sure. "Not if you'll let me stay." Clara smiled, a slow, genuine thing that reached her eyes and softened the lines of worry she had carried for so long. "I wasn't planning on letting you leave." They stood there for a long moment, wrapped in the quiet certainty of the moment, the frozen creek flowing steadily beneath them, the sky shifting from pale gray to the soft gold of early dusk. The valley didn't change. The mountains didn't move. But something fundamental had shifted in the space between them. The house waiting for them down the trail was no longer a monument to loss. It was a place where two people had finally decided to stop surviving and start living. Elias turned his hand, brushing his thumb lightly over her knuckles, feeling the steady pulse beneath her skin. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. He didn't need to. For the first time in 3 years, he wasn't afraid of the unknown. He was just ready to face it, together. The wind stirred the branches above them, shaking loose a light dusting of snow that settled over their shoulders like a quiet blessing. He didn't brush it away. He simply stood there, holding her hand, letting the moment stretch into something permanent. The thaw didn't announce itself with fanfare or sudden warmth. It came as a slow, persistent unraveling, a quiet surrender of the valley to the turning of the season. Patches of snow retreated from the fence lines and fence posts, revealing damp earth, the dark bark of cottonwoods, and the first stubborn shoots of winter grass pushing through the frost. The creek, once sealed beneath a sheet of pale, uneven ice, now murmured steadily beneath the breaking crust, its voice carrying through the open windows of the cabin like a low, grounding hum. Inside, the house bore the unmistakable marks of shared hands and renewed purpose. The heavy, dust-laden curtains that had filtered the winter light into thin gray slants had been taken down, washed, and replaced with simple linen that caught the morning sun and held it. The floorboards, once swept with mechanical detachment, now held the faint scuff marks of daily life, a worn runner laid across the parlor threshold, and the quiet, lived-in warmth of a space that no longer felt like a waiting room. The mantel told the clearest story of the shift. Where a single face-down photograph and stacks of untouched ledgers had once stood in rigid silence, There now rested a row of smooth river stones collected from the creek bank, a bundle of dried lavender tied with twine, a small ceramic vase holding early crocuses, and the photograph, turned face up, cleaned, and placed beside a framed sketch of the valley Clara had drawn during one of her evening walks. The air no longer carried the sharp scent of cold ash and isolation. It held the earthy perfume of pine soap, the faint sweetness of rising dough, and the clean, damp tang of freshly turned soil from the kitchen garden plot they had staked and tilled together in early April. Clara had mapped it out with careful precision, noting which side caught the morning light, where the wind swept heaviest, and how to space the rows so the roots wouldn't choke each other. She planted seeds with the same quiet focus she brought to balancing the ranch accounts, treating each tiny packet as a promise rather than a chore. Clara's presence had settled into the rhythm of the land with an authority that required no announcement. She sat at the kitchen table most afternoons, her pen moving in steady, practiced arcs across a fresh stack of invoices. She had reorganized the spring supply routes, negotiated a fair price for the yearling calves with the territorial buyer, and established a rotating schedule for the neighboring ranchers to share plows, harnesses, and seed drills. Her ledgers were no longer a frantic record of survival, but a clear blueprint for steady growth. When she wasn't balancing numbers, she walked the half-mile trail to the Miller homestead, where 3 children sat on a sun-warmed porch step, their slates ready for her lessons in arithmetic, geography, and basic reading. She never asked for payment beyond a basket of fresh eggs, a sack of winter potatoes, or a jar of blackberry preserves wrapped in clean cloth. But the real currency was the shift in the valley's atmosphere. Neighbors who had once avoided Elias' property out of respectful discomfort now tipped their hats as they passed on the main trail. They stopped to borrow tools, to ask about soil composition, to leave baskets of preserves or sacks of flour on the fence post without knocking. The ranch was no longer an island of quiet grief. It had become woven into the community's living rhythm, a place where people came not out of pity, but out of mutual respect. Elias watched it all from the porch steps. He stood with his back against the sun-warmed wood, his arms crossed loosely over his chest, his boots planted firmly on the new pine boards they had measured, cut, and laid down together when the ground finally dried. The whitewash on the cabin walls gleamed in the pale spring light, a stark, clean contrast to the weathered gray timber that had stood for years untouched. He remembered the man who had lived in that gray house 3 months ago, a man who measured time by chores endured, who flinched at unexpected footsteps, who believed that stillness was the only armor strong enough to keep the past at bay. That man was still there, woven into the grain of his bones, the quiet spaces between his thoughts, but he no longer dictated the shape of the days. He had learned that grief didn't have to be a wall. It could simply be a stone in the foundation, something solid to build upon rather than hide behind. A screen door creaked behind him. Clara stepped out onto the porch, carrying 2 tin mugs of tea. She handed one to him, her fingers brushing his lightly before she settled into the rocker beside him. She didn't speak immediately. She simply watched a pair of swallows dart across the clearing, their wings catching the light, their cries sharp and bright against the quiet yard. "The southern fence held through the melt," she said finally, her voice calm, carrying easily over the gentle breeze. "Harlan's boys helped pull the sagging posts, left them a basket of dried apples as thanks, said their mother asked when you'd be coming to town again." "Good," Elias replied, taking a slow sip. The tea was hot, bitter, familiar. "Tell them the lower pasture needs reseeding next week. I'll haul the seed in myself. Check the drainage first." "You will," she agreed, a faint smile touching her lips, her eyes catching the sun. "But I'm driving the wagon. Your shoulders still stiff from hauling that new gate post." And you promised Mayview. Dee help fix her root cellar door before the rains come back. He almost argued, almost insisted he didn't need mollycoddling, that he could manage his own joints and his own schedule. But the protest died before it reached his throat. Instead, he nodded. You drive. I'll load the sacks. Check the axles before we pull out. The quiet that followed wasn't heavy. It wasn't the silence of two people tolerating each other's presence. It was the kind of stillness that only exists when two people have learned how to occupy the same space without competing for air, without bracing for the next shift in the wind. He watched her trace the rim of her mug with her thumb, her shoulders relaxed, her gaze steady on the horizon. He realized with a sudden quiet clarity that settled deep in his chest that he was no longer waiting for the other shoe to drop. He was no longer bracing for loss. He was simply breathing. The tightness that had lived beneath his ribs for 3 years had loosened into something steady, something warm. The sun felt different on his face. It didn't just illuminate the yard. It reached him. And for the first time in a long time, he let it. 2 years later, the homestead didn't just endure the seasons. It breathed with them. The valley had settled into the steady, unhurried rhythm of late spring, the air thick with the scent of blooming clover, damp earth, and the faint, sweet smoke of wood fires drifting from neighboring chimneys. The ranch had expanded not in acreage, but in life. The lower pasture now supported a second horse, a sturdy bay gelding with a gentle temperament and a coat that gleamed in the sun, grazing peacefully near the creek line, where the willows dipped their branches into the slow-moving water. The cabin's porch had been widened to catch the morning light, lined with potted herbs, a weathered wooden bench, and a small wind chime that Clara's students had crafted from tin spoons and smooth river glass. Inside, the transformation was complete. The once silent parlor now held the soft, scattered evidence of a thriving household. A sturdy oak crib positioned near the hearth for safety and warmth, a low rug covered in wooden blocks and cloth dolls, a bookshelf that had grown from 3 shelves to 8, its spines a mix of practical manuals, children's stories, and well-worn poetry collections. The house no longer felt like a monument to what had been lost. It felt like a living thing, rooted deeply in the present. Elias stood at the edge of the newly reinforced north fence, his hands working the heavy wire with practiced, unhurried precision. The sun was high, casting long, clean shadows across the grass, and the air carried the distant, cheerful shouts of children playing near the Miller barn. He paused to wipe his brow with the back of his sleeve, his shoulders broad and strong beneath a faded work shirt, his face clean-shaven, his expression calm. The years had softened the hard edges of his grief without erasing them. They had simply made room for something else. He drove a fresh post into the damp earth, tamped it level, and secured the wire with a final, firm twist. His movements were efficient, grounded, utterly devoid of the frantic urgency that had once driven him. He worked because it needed doing. He rested because he knew he could. The difference was quiet, but it was everything. A few yards away, beneath the wide canopy of an old oak tree, Clara sat on a woven blanket with their 2-year-old daughter balanced comfortably against her knee. The little girl had dark, unruly hair that caught the light like polished walnut, and eyes the exact steady gray of Elias's. She held a thick-boarded picture book open in her small hands, her finger tracing the inked lines of a painted cow and a wooden barn. Clara's voice was low and even, weaving the simple story into the afternoon air with a natural cadence that felt as familiar as the wind in the branches. She didn't perform. She simply shared. The child listened intently, occasionally babbling a word or pointing at a picture, her small body relaxed, utterly secure in the circle of her mother's arms. Clara paused to adjust the shawl draped over the toddler's shoulders, her touch gentle, her gaze soft with a quiet, unshakable contentment. She had found her place not by force but by steady, patient presence. And she had built a life that felt to both of them like coming home. Elias finished the last splice, coiled the excess wire, and stood. He brushed the dirt from his gloves, took a slow breath, and turned toward the shade of the oak. He didn't call out. He simply walked over, his boots quiet on the grass, and stopped a few feet from the blanket. Clara looked up. The little girl followed her mother's gaze, her eyes widening with immediate recognition before she broke into a bright, gap-toothed smile. "Papa," she chirped, reaching out with sticky, flour-dusted hands. "Hey there, little bird," Elias murmured, his voice rough but warm. He knelt, ignoring the protest in his knees, and let her small hands pat his cheeks, feeling the familiar, grounding weight of her against his chest. He looked up at Clara. She smiled, not with excitement, but with a deep, settled certainty that had weathered storms and quiet days alike. There were no grand declarations needed. The truth was written in the space between them, in the steady rhythm of the child's breathing, in the way the sunlight filtered through the leaves and painted their faces in dappled gold. He had once believed that opening his heart meant betraying the past. He had been wrong. Healing wasn't about replacement. It was about expansion. It was about learning that love doesn't erase loss. It simply teaches you how to carry it without letting it pull you under. He reached out, his calloused fingers brushing lightly over Clara's wrist. She turned her hand, lacing her fingers through his in a slow, deliberate motion that felt like a quiet vow. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The years of held breath, the sleepless nights, the careful distance, the raw confession by the frozen creek, all of it had led to this exact moment. Not a dramatic triumph, but a quiet, mutual choosing. A life built on steady hands, shared tea, honest words, and the courage to face tomorrow together. He pulled back slightly, standing to his full height, and looked out over the pasture. The fence line stood straight. The garden rows were neat and thriving. The cabin door stood slightly ajar, letting in the afternoon breeze. The land that had once held only silence and grief now hummed with the sounds of a shared future. He felt it settle in his chest, not as a sudden rush, but as a deep, unshakable peace. He had spent years surviving. Now, finally, he was living. And as the wind stirred the grass and the little girl leaned back against her mother, laughing at a fluttering butterfly, Elias Vance closed his eyes and let himself simply be present, grateful, whole, rooted. If this story stayed with you, ride with us again. Subscribe and help keep these frontier tales alive for the next firelit night. Because out here, every name has a past, every trail has a cost, and every sunset still remembers. Until next time, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past and your heart pointed west.